again. I'll wait. Here to introduce our next presenter is Tim Donaldson.
64 years ago, J.R.R. Tolkien's classic, The Lord of the Rings trilogy, was published. I tried to read it, I really did. Once in high school, once again in college. I hang my head in shame as I tell you I failed to even get through the first 100 pages of the first book. So when I was presented with Mark Krupinski's idea for a novel, I did ask myself, was I the best fit? I'd seen the Lord of the Rings movies, well, at least the first two. But then, after talking with Mark, I knew this was a project I wanted to be a part of. As you will soon learn, in A Clutch of Knaves, Mark has taken the world of the dwarves and the elves, a world full of magic and mischief, and he has woven a mischief of his own. Where Tolkien gave us heroes to be admired, Mark gives us heroes who are less than desirable. Where most writers, following the standards set by the ancient Greeks, would give a single fatal flaw, Mark gives us a whole slew of flaws, with maybe one, and I stress maybe, one single virtue. And what this does is make for a hilarious journey, one that almost anyone, with possibly the exception of the super serious Tolkien fan, can enjoy. During Mark's journey of writing A Clutch of Knaves, one of the conversations we had was how to create a world that both the fantasy reader as well as the non-fantasy reader can fall into and enjoy. This is a conversation I think most writers have. Maybe it's more than a conversation, maybe it's an obsession. We worry about whether or not our characters are relatable. We worry about whether or not our readers will want to take the time to slip into the worlds we have created. And when writing humor, we worry about whether or not our jokes are working. As one who could not get through even one fantasy novel, I can tell you that Mark has created a world where the characters are relatable. I want to get lost in his world. I want to know what will happen to Westmouth and Gamnell. And one reason for this is that these two are as flawed as the people I know out here in the real world. I don't think Mark was trying to mirror the current climate in America per se, but that's exactly what he's doing. But whereas we often cringe at the reality that surrounds us, Mark makes us laugh. And right now we could all use a laugh. It's with great pleasure I introduce Mark Krupinski.
Let's see. It's up to you. It's not on.
Do it.
You want on?
Do it.
Okay, very cool. Awesome. Thank you so much to Tim for that introduction. Big thanks also to everybody in the Rowan Writing Arts Department. You know, a lot of support, a lot of love in this room right now. But again, special thanks to Tim and also Ron Block for dealing with my nonsense for as long as they have. You know, if I send an email at 1 in the morning, 2 days ago, saying, hey, which is funnier, boogers or spit, I promptly receive like actual feedback. So that's pretty good. But yeah, this is my project. Well, this is a PowerPoint about my project. I call it A Clutch of Knaves because it needed to have a title. And I very much like that sort of fantasy naming convention, you know, a noun of nouns or whatever. A dance of dragons, a feast for crows, a brunch for Terry, you know, it's all very theatrical. And I like genre fiction and the conventions that come with it. I feel like genre fiction gets kind of a bum rap a lot of the time, especially comedic genre fiction, if I could make myself the underdog for a moment. But, I'll make myself the underdog for the whole evening. But, yeah, I want to talk more about my influences, but before I do that, we gotta kind of go back to see where the seeds that would germinate into this project were first sown.
It began with the forging of the great rings.
No, it didn't. Why? Really, my relationship with the fantasy genre goes back much farther than that. Of course, there are all the standards that I was into as a kid. Harry Potter was my first real love affair with a book that didn't have that many pictures. Naturally, Star Wars, the original Star Wars trilogy, was a weekly rental from Blockbuster in my house. And even though you might not think it is actually fantasy. You know, it just happens to take place in space. It's a long time ago in a faraway land. There's magic and wizards and prophecies and all that good hero's journey type stuff. And of course, The Lord of the Rings. I really appreciate Tim mentioning that he hadn't read The Lord of the Rings, because guess what? Neither have I. I know that's like sacrilege. That's like if I was running to be the next pope and I was like, I skimmed the Bible. But I got 30 pages in, they were still talking about breakfast. I had better things to do. But as I got older, my tastes developed some more, and I engaged with a lot of other entries in the fantasy genre. Over here is a film called Wizards, which I cannot even begin to go into the plot of this one, but if you're looking for some cool, whacked-out animation from the late 70s, check that out. Of course, Game of Thrones, final season. And anybody who knows me knows I'm very much into comic books. I liked Aquaman before he was played by Jason Momoa. But what I've come to understand is that fantasy is a very versatile genre. You know, there are a lot of elements you can mix and mash with it. It doesn't necessarily just have to be a bunch of short people wandering around the hills of New Zealand. You know, you can implement all kinds of bits and pieces from different genres, different settings, different types of literary devices. And naturally, as what many might call an indoor child growing up, who liked fantasy, who liked reading, who liked writing, it was only a matter of time until I ended up involved in the world of tabletop gaming. You know, Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu. We'll talk more about that one in a minute. But yeah, given my social circle, it was kind of impossible to not get wrapped up in some of these games as time went on, and I'm really glad I did, because they're just a heck of a time. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I have some terminology up here, so I don't sound like an absolute lunatic to people who aren't really familiar. It is a niche hobby, and that's kind of why I like it so much. But if I ever refer to a DM that refers to Dungeon Master, it's not as kinky as it sounds, I promise. That's basically just the person who runs the game. The party is the group of players, the campaign, the storyline that the game is focused around, and any mention of rolls refers to, of course, dice rolls, which determine all number of things. Now, my first experience playing a tabletop role-playing game was Call of Cthulhu, not the H.P. Lovecraft story, but an RPG game set in the world of H.P. Lovecraft. Yeah, there was my character. I dug up my old sketches. Isn't he intimidating looking? He's just the most boring dude ever. I've gotten much better at it, I hope. But it was still a load of fun. I remember very distinctly, there were a lot of wild adventures we went on in this campaign, sitting around my one friend's dining room table. At one point, my character, Donnie, I believe his name was, had teamed up with the other, one of my friends who I had known since second grade, who was playing as the disavowed son of J.D. Rockefeller. Sure. We found ourselves at one point in a bordello, specifically in the kitchen, the most interesting part of a bordello, where we went on to try and make alcoholic oatmeal. Before we get to the question and answer period, the answer is, I don't know. This became kind of an edible Molotov cocktail, and we proceeded to accidentally burn the bordello to the ground. At a later point in the campaign, one of our other party members whipped a brick at a wall for whatever reason. We rolled the dice, and as it turned out, the brick struck the wall with such force that it ricocheted off and clobbered one of our party members clean in the head, leaving her drifting in and out of consciousness for the rest of the game. We also had a lovely character named Wolf. Wolf was a hulking German assassin with a Japanese katana. Again, I don't know. At one point in the game, Wolf fell overboard. We were on a boat, he fell into the water. And because of his dense musculature, he promptly sank to the bottom and drowned to death. This was the average experience in this game. And meanwhile, while all of this is happening, the cult of Dagon was preparing all sorts of blood rituals, sacrificing innocent people to summon forth the old one, Nyarlathotep, who would reduce the world of man to embers and ash. Pretty serious stuff. And the people tasked with taking care of this had attempted to weaponize breakfast. I played a lot of other role-playing games after the fact, and I noticed a recurring theme that very, very, very silly things happened, no matter how dire the circumstances of the campaign were. You know, we could be out trying to save the fate of the world, not just the world, but all of reality, and we were just a bunch of silly, silly fools. And I noticed that this tone was reflected in a lot of the media that I came to enjoy, things like Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters isn't about proton packs and ghosts, it's about starting a small business. They could be fighting koala bears and it would be the same movie. The whole point is that the threat is real. And if it was anything but those guys handling it, it wouldn't be a comedy. Similarly, the films of James Gunn, especially Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Not to spoil the ending of this for anybody, but the last shot of Guardians 2 is a close-up on the face of a CGI raccoon who is shedding one single tear at a space funeral. And I was emotionally invested in that. And I knew if I could write something and get that moment, that crying space funeral raccoon moment, out of my audience, I had done my job. You know, other things like The Venture Brothers, big genre parody that has very real character growth over the course of its 7+ seasons. I had also found that I wrote a lot of backstory for these characters. I very, very much embraced that part of the game. This was for a campaign that lasted 3 sessions and then was promptly forgotten about. But it's still a great time. And so I had an idea while playing actually that campaign and ruminating on this idea of silly characters, real danger. What if someone was to take a book like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, satire, genre fiction, very funny book, and combine it with classical swords and sorcery fantasy? Whatever came out the other end would surely be comedy gold. And to any of you who are thinking the word Discworld right now, I say, shh. It seemed like a very, very good idea, and I suppose it still does because I've come this far. I mean, there's plenty of precedent for combining comedy and fantasy and it working out really, really well.
You're indeed brave tonight, but the fight is mine.
Oh, and enough, eh?
You stupid bastard! Got the arms left. Yes, I have. No! Just a flesh wound.
But yes, in my work, the main thing that I wanted to capture from those games, from my time spent playing those games, was the sense of camaraderie, the sense of fun, and of course, the silliness that came with it. Because even though we were on a grand epic quest to defeat all manner of nasty things and discover incredible truths about ourselves, at the end of the day, we were a bunch of friends sitting around a dining room table, eating snacks and laughing. We were having fun, no matter how dramatic the story got. And that always bubbled to the surface, and tainted is a bad word, tinged the drama that was going on. I wanted to make something by the fans and for the fans of the genre of fantasy, of tabletop gaming, because I feel like it doesn't get a lot of positive representation, or at least a lot of accurate representation in the mainstream, especially when you're blending comedy into the mix. I find it's very kind of cynical, you know. A lot of mainstream depictions of things like tabletop games and fantasy end up looking sort of like this.
I've got my helm of lordly might, my boots of speed, and if things get too exciting, my inhaler of asthma.
What a hilarious stereotype. Excuse me for a moment. Anyway, I wanted to make it real. I wanted to make it genuine. Because I believe that if you're going to engage with a genre, you should love and respect it, even if you're going to poke fun at it. You should understand why the genre works and have sort of a reverence for it, even if you are going to step back and tweak its nose a little bit. And so I began building my world and establishing my characters, because I feel like, at least in this sort of scenario, that's the most important thing. I'm very big on character-driven narratives and character-driven humor especially. So I knew that before I sorted out anything else, before I decided what the big mountain was named, and what the MacGuffin was called, and who is the bad guy, currently Bastard, but that's a placeholder, as Ron is familiar with. The important thing was to get a sense of what my world was and who were the people who lived inside of it. So, allow me to talk about the main party. Let me introduce my main characters. First up, we have Wesmith, a washed-up spellcaster. Used to be a big deal, is not so much anymore until he is thrust back into the world of adventuring. For his character, I very much always liked the wise old sage. You know, your Dumbledores, your Gandalfs, your Yodas, your Obi-Wans. And I thought, how could I kind of turn that on its head a little bit? And I realized, you know, Dumbledore is a very smart guy, but his plans often involve lots of children getting murdered. So, what if I presented him from that lens, as a wise old sage who really isn't all that wise? I blended in some some fictional characters that I tend to enjoy, namely the dude from The Big Lebowski, of course. I feel like that's just a really nice match, that kind of archetype with the wizard. Next up, of course, we have Gamnell, because every party needs a dwarf character. And the dwarves in my setting, I always thought it would be pretty funny if they weren't, you know, boisterous and all about blood and ale and all that good stuff, but if they were more reserved, more about, you know, craftsmanship and mercantilism, if they were that, like, middle-aged dad who sat in his finished basement reading books about World War II, you know? That type. And then I thought it'd be funny if the dwarf that came from that society was a very rambunctious, blood and ale and combat type of guy. So, he's not particularly bright, but he knows how to use his mechanical mind. We have the Princess Delvine, wayward royal heir to a race of undersea fish people. I like to play off of the idea of the kind of stereotypical princess. She's a little naive, she's a little out of her element, literally. The kind of genesis of this character is, I think the idea of a reverse mermaid is hilarious. If you're not familiar with the concept, it's a creature where the legs are human, but the upper part is the fish. And I thought, what if a regular mermaid came from a race of reverse mermaids, and they all thought she was a hideous, deformed freak? So there's Delphine. Her story mainly deals with overcoming those insecurities, sort of exploring this world she's now a bigger part of. We also have Azalea, our halfling. She is a healer, also a bit of a workaholic, because halflings or hobbits, as you might know them, they're very lazy people. They're kind of a nice little commune of burnouts. They like their five weed, they like their potatoes, and their 7 breakfasts. They don't do a whole lot. So she's sort of counter to that. She's got bigger ambitions. We also have our thief, Dennis. Of all these people, Dennis is actually quite good at his job, which is stealing stuff. The only problem is he has utterly abysmal luck. I love the, blackguard with a heart of gold archetype, and I especially really like the idea of characters who talk a big game, but then can totally back it up. Characters who are very full of themselves, but are also very capable. Because then when they inevitably get their comeuppance for being a jerk, it's way more funny and way more inventive. And then rounding out the last of the party, we have Faendrel. He is a dark elf, he is prissy, his interests include himself and skeletons. He's a necromancer, meaning that even though he's a wannabe socialite, that's a weird way that I said that. He spends a lot of time in his basement experimenting with dead bodies. So, with my cast established, I'd like to move into a little excerpt, a little snippet from Chapter 1. And before I get into this, 2 disclaimers. One, there is some, shall we say, colorful language. So if you have sensitive ears, take care of that. And second, I am going to be doing voices. So mentally and emotionally prepare yourselves for this. Mom, Dad, I'm sorry. Right, so this is an excerpt from Chapter 1 of A Clutch of Names, where we have seen our boy Wesmith attending his favorite public house. Ahoy, traveller! Welcome to the Battered Beaver Inn. A rotund barkeep called towards the door as he looked up from the glass he was polishing. Oh, it's just you, Wesmith. The usual for you then. Yes, sir, Doug, Wesmith replied, taking his usual spot at the end of the bar. How's business? Better, as of late, actually, said Doug, filling a splotchy mug with pitch black stout. Don't know if you've heard, but Petunia has gone and retired. You're shitting me, said Wesmith. What happened? So I'm back here the other day like usual, right? And in walks Petunia, Doug began to explain, leaning on the bar. I'm over here thinking, oh, here we go, yeah? Busy night, we'd only just finished repairing all the furniture from the last time she moseyed on in here looking for work. And here she comes, dipping her head through the threshold, clumping on up to the bar. I remember when she shacked up at that hunting party, Wesmith said, nursing his pint. I mean, forget all the screaming, but the smell. Right? Doug continued. So I'm preparing for a long night, because you can't exactly throw a girl that size out if she's not willing to go quietly, can you? And she just stomps on up to the bar, looks me dead in the eye, and starts crying. Crying, said Wesmith. Petunia was crying. Like a wee babe, said Doug. Doug, you know the kind of things I've seen, Wesmith said, but I don't think I've ever seen a half-orc cry. I've seen Petunia eat an onion like it was an apple. Remember that one time she just pulled one of her teeth out right in front of us just to see if she could? And you're saying she was crying. Swear to me, Mum, said Doug, holding his hook hand over his heart. So naturally, I wasn't expecting that. I ask her, what's wrong? And she says, Doug dropped his voice a few octaves for effect, I'm afraid this is goodbye, Douglas. Never pegged her for the same amount of time, Wesmith chuckled, taking another sip of his beer. That ain't the half of it, Doug continued, a grin stretching out across his pudgy cheeks. I say, well, where are you going to? And get this, she tells me she's gone and got herself married. Wesmith choked, setting a mouthful of stout into his sinuses and back out again. Excuse me, he sputtered, beer dripping from his beard and nose staining the front of his robes. And that's not even the best part, Doug continued, clearly pleased with the effect his story had on the wizard. I keep myself composed, ask who the lucky fella is to finally tie a firebrand like her down. And she points to a wee gnome sitting in the corner. Oh my God, said Wesmith. And I ask her, what, behind the short fella? She tells me no. That's him. Apparently he's a traveling con man, told us some crock about being a dwarfish prince. Wanted to make her his stone wife or something asinine like that. And apparently the poor thing can't tell the difference between a gnome and a dwarf, so... Oh my God, said Wesmith. And you just let her go on believing that? Oh, come on now, Doug began. You should have seen the way her eyes lit up when she was talking about that wee lad. I couldn't tell her she'd be crushed. Didn't know you were such at shaping a romance, Westmouth replied. Or she just get mad and crush me, Doug said. I ain't about to go ruin her honeymoon, have her sulking around here, scaring away all my customers with still got functioning pelvises. It's bad for business. Westmouth considered Doug's logic for a moment, realizing he was currently the only customer inside the dingy mountainside tavern. There wasn't too much foot traffic up this far as it was, and as far as houses of ill repute go, the Battered Beaver had accrued quite the reputation for being, amongst other things, almost concerningly dank. This too suited Westmouth just fine. Before Westmouth could continue the conversation, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the tavern door slamming into the wall, the drafty mountain air causing the candlelight throughout the bar to jump and flicker. In the doorway stood a trio of men. The first to enter was also the shortest, and from the looks of things, the oldest, his hairline having long since receded to the back of his head. His thin eyebrows and slight overbite framed a sizably faded scar on the left side of his face. His stubby nose crinkled as he stepped inside the bar, the smell of the mountain replaced by the thick stank of rotting wood and stale beer. Behind the older fellow was a walking wall of muscle. At first glance, Westmouth thought he might be a half-orc like Petunia, if not for his tanned complexion and lack of tusks. Draped across his back sat a sizable club that just barely scraped the top of the doorway. Behind the behemoth stood a much slimmer man, easily the youngest of the trio, the top of his head hidden by a flowing cloak. Westmouth turned back to his beer as Doug turned on the charm. Welcome, friends, to the Battered Beaver Inn. Coming out of the cold, care for a fresh dwarven stout? Just tapped a new keg this morning, Doug said with a toothy smile. Or perhaps something stronger. Oh, we are not thirsty, said the bald man as he and his compatriots approached the bar, the floorboards creaking under their boots. Then perhaps something to eat. I've got a pot of stew on the fire, best pottage this side of the mountain. The men drew closer. Maybe some warm beds for the night. The trio arrived at the bar, the bald man sidling up next to Westmouth. Friend, the bald man began, why don't you give us every coin you've got stashed in this stump before I'm forced to do something unkind to the old man? Westmouth choked on his beer a second time as the diminutive highwayman clapped him on the shoulder, brandishing a small, sharp dagger. Wait a minute, Westmouth thought. Old. Now, boys, let's not be unreasonable, said Doug, his hands raised. No need for all that. I suppose you're right, the bald man said, looking around the empty tavern. Rock. Quick as a flash, the muscular giant reeled back and threw a hellacious haymaker, sending Doug flying backwards into the liquor shelves. He ain't getting up anytime soon. Rock chuckled dimly to himself. What now, Patsy? You two case the place, the bald man commanded. See if there's anything worth swiping from this shithole. And you, he added, turning to Westmouth, just sit right where you are, geez. Wouldn't want you to have an accident. Okay, first of all, Westmouth began, enough with the old man stuff. You want to talk, I mean, look at you, your crow's feet have crow's feet. And second of all, Westmouth stood, flourishing his hands. With an angry grunt, Patsy made to stab the wizard in the chest, only to find that his dagger had turned into a live slug, roughly the size of a large yam. He let out a disgusted shriek and dropped the creature to the ground, wiping mucus onto his tunic before turning back up at Westmouth. Oh shit, he said, his eyebrows leaping upward a solid inch. You're magic! Westmouth grinned, his sleeves pulled back over his forearms. Rock, Patsy yelled. Get him! Oh boy, get him, Westmouth remarked, sidestepping as the giant charged at him. Clearly, you're the brains of the operation. With another wave of his hands, Westmouth seemed to seize control of Rock's momentum, propelling him into the air and towards the door at the front of the bar. The brute's boulder-shaped head smashed through the wooden door, only for his large club to catch on the doorway. With a dazed grunt, Rock slumped backwards onto the floor, his sizable bulk causing the bottles and glassware in the tavern to rattle and clink. Damn, Westmouth said, I thought that'd be quite enough. Before he could react, Patsy's fist cuffed him across the jaw, sending him to the ground as well. You turned my knife into a slug! He screeched, booting Westmouth in the gut. The old mage sputtered. You disrespectful, old shitbag, he said, punctuating each word with another kick. Oh, Westmouth grunted. Well, if it's any consolation, the spell should wear off eventually. His stubby nostrils flaring, Patsy hauled back to deliver one last stomp to Westmouth's face. The wizard seized up before a mighty crash rang out through the bar. After a moment of silence, Patsy fell to the ground next to Westmouth. Behind him stood the young man in the cloak, holding a shattered bottle of mead. Thanks for that, Westmouth said, spitting a bit of blood onto the floorboards. But a word of advice. Maybe don't make a habit of betraying your employers if you want to make it big in the world of roving thievery. Well, then it's a good thing I don't plan to make a career of it, the young man replied, stepping over Patsy to help the mage to his feet. But it was necessary for me to ingratiate myself with these two louts, as their fates intertwined with yours, Westmouth of High Point. And that's where we're going to leave it for now.
so familiar with the tropes of fantasy and of mythology and Star Wars and all of that, right? And I think the people of my generation have a fearful kind of view of that because we start feeling the loss of originality, you know. But I don't feel like people of your generation look at it that way. You know, like you have almost a joyful kind of willingness to manipulate the tropes in different ways. What are your thoughts about that? Is originality a particularly important thing to you, or how have you redefined it? I guess
That's an interesting question. I think to a degree, I would say definitely originality matters. I do kind of think that we're almost reaching the point, because I mean, there's no such thing as a totally original idea. You know, everything has been done before in some way, shape, or form. Even something that we consider as groundbreaking and revolutionary as Star Wars, it's Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress, but it's in space. You know, with a little bit of the Searchers thrown in there. All of these classic archetypes, they all come from somewhere. So even the most original ideas are kind of reshaping and reinterpreting and recontextualizing those old tropes. So, yeah, I think it's definitely important to be original. I definitely don't want to just make literally Fellowship of the Ring, but with fart jokes. But I also don't feel the need necessarily to come up with something that is so out there that nobody has ever thought of it before, because that I don't think necessarily correlates to quality.
I brought up in the introduction, and I know we briefly in an email talked about it, but I said how I feel like you're almost mirroring our times, like as ridiculous as things are. Do you see a connection between the world you're creating and the world we're living in, or did I just put that in there?
No, this is really interesting, because I mean, for as much as I've worked on this and as much as I've developed it, in a lot of ways it's still kind of in its infancy. Scratch that, it's still definitely in its infancy. And I think in some ways, yes. I wouldn't say in any explicit ways. Like, I don't think there's anything in here where it's like, you know, what's in the news today? Let's replace this noun with elves, and ooh, you know. But I don't know, I think maybe from the sensibility of it, maybe, because I mean, kid of the 90s, I'm very sarcastic, and you know, I like that kind of humor where it's sort of tweaking the nose of that which has come before. So maybe in that regard, and I definitely wouldn't cancel it out for the future, but I don't know. I guess I think laughter is a really important thing. If I could get like sappy for a moment, I think humor is so important. I think laughter is a gateway to way more complex and quote-unquote serious emotions. I think it's really important when things are annoying or weird or absurd to not take things too seriously. So I guess in a way, yeah, kind of. Any other questions? Oh boy. Let's do Jeff first.
Hi.
Hi.
Your dialogue cadence is so natural. It's so funny. Are you pulling from anything specific when you're taking that style? Or is it just an amalgamation? Or?
Kind of an amalgamation. Full disclosure, actually, when I first started writing that scene that I wrote, where it's just the conversation in the bar, because there's nothing scarier than a blank page. When I started writing that, I actually, in another tab, had the script to The Big Lebowski open, because I think the dialogue in that movie is like the pinnacle of naturalistic. So not that I copy and pasted it, but I just sort of, I had it there as like inspiration, like a little photograph on the cockpit, you know, to remind me of what I'm fighting for. But a lot of it too was sort of putting it in my headspace of playing those tabletop games, except I am everyone at the table.
So, like, even with that scene, the jokes kind of just rolled one into the other and built on top of each other. So, could you speak to, like, the process of going through and adding those jokes or revising them, and how much that changed over time?
As in, like, just sort of like when it felt right to throw a joke in there?
Yeah.
It depends on the kind of scene I was going for. If it was something like The Bar where I wanted to be kind of loose and comedic, I would try and put at least one thing that made me laugh every page. Really, it was a lot of reading it out loud. It was a lot of sitting in the Victoria offices at 4 in the morning after everyone had left, sitting there going like, I don't know, Smith, just talking to myself, leaving a lot of very interesting footage for the security personnel to watch. But yeah, I think a lot of it is just trial and error, just putting down what seems like a good idea and then reading it out to see if it is.